From snowstorms to second chances, how a struggling single dad saved a pregnant teen and found a miracle. A cold night, a kind heart. The wind howled outside, whistling through the trees and sweeping the snow into thick, swirling patterns across the quiet roads of the small town in Vermont. Chad Callahan had been working all day, his body sore from the repairs he'd done at his shop. His mind, however, was still sharp, thinking of his daughter Mia, who was probably waiting for him at home, eager for their usual quiet evening together. It had been another long winter, and the snow didn't seem to want to stop falling, covering the world in a blanket of white. Chad's old Chevy truck creaked and groaned under the weight of the snow, its tires struggling to make it up the slippery hills. He squinted through the windshield, the wipers working hard to keep the snow from blurring his view. The heater, barely functional, did little to cut through the chill that seemed to creep up through the truck's worn seams. Still, Chad didn't mind. It was home, and that was enough. He thought of Mia, just 8 years old, and the way she would always pretend not to worry when he was late. Chad smiled softly to himself. Mia had always been the strong one since his wife Laura passed away. She was the one who kept him grounded, the one who reminded him that life went on, no matter how hard it got. As Chad rounded the bend and turned onto the narrow road leading to their cabin, his headlights suddenly swept over something on the side of the road. For a moment, he thought it was just a bag of trash, or perhaps a deer something harmless. But then it moved. Chad's heart skipped a beat. He slammed on the brakes, the tires crunching to a halt on the icy road. He shifted into reverse, unsure of what he was seeing, and as the truck backed up, the headlights illuminated the figure more clearly. A young woman, no older than 17 or 18, was sitting on the shoulder of the road, huddled in the snow. Her arms were wrapped tightly around her knees, her face hidden beneath a mess of wet, tangled hair. Her coat was too thin, and her face had a bluish tint, the cold already taking a toll on her. Chad's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he threw the truck into park, slammed the door open, and stepped into the cold. The snow bit at his skin, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the girl sitting there, shivering uncontrollably, looking as though the world had forgotten her. He took a step toward her, calling out gently, "Hey, are you okay?" The girl flinched, but she didn't respond. Chad walked closer, his boots crunching on the snow, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw how pale she was, her lips tinged blue, her shoulders trembling. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes were filled with pain, exhaustion, and something close to defeat. "I'm fine," she rasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. "No, you're not," Chad replied gently but firmly, taking another step toward her. "You're freezing out here." She didn't argue, but the way she looked at him said it all. She was too tired to fight, too lost to care. She was a stranger, but that didn't matter. Chad couldn't just leave her out here, not in this condition. "Look, I have a cabin just down the road," he said, his voice softening. "It's warm, dry. You don't have to talk if you don't want to. You can leave whenever you want. But I can't just drive away and pretend I didn't see you." The girl hesitated for a long moment, the wind swirling around them, biting at their skin. Then, as if she had no strength left to argue, she nodded faintly. Chad moved quickly to help her to her feet. She stumbled, and he steadied her, feeling how light she was, almost too light. Her frailness struck him hard, and for a moment, a wave of protectiveness washed over him. She was a stranger, yes, but she was a person in need, and he couldn't walk away from that. They made their way to the truck in silence. The girl curled into herself as they drove, huddled against the seat as though trying to disappear into the warmth of the truck. Chad glanced at her from time to time, but she didn't speak. He didn't press her for conversation. All he wanted was to get her somewhere safe. When they finally arrived at the cabin, the warmth inside hit them like a wave. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending up a soft glow that filled the room with the comforting smell of burning wood and cinnamon. Mia was asleep on the couch, the book she had been reading still open on her chest, a flashlight dimming in her hand. Chad smiled softly at the sight, then turned to the girl in the doorway. "There's soup on the stove," he said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I'll get you a towel." The girl said nothing but followed him silently, leaving a trail of wet snow behind her. When Chad handed her the bowl of soup, he noticed how she ate slowly, almost desperately, as though she hadn't had a real meal in days. He watched her carefully, his heart heavy with the realization of just how much this young woman had been through. When she finished, he offered her the upstairs bedroom. "It's not fancy, but it's warm," he said. "Bathroom's down the hall. You can sleep as long as you need to." The girl hesitated, then finally looked at him. Her eyes, tired and guarded, softened just a little. "Thank you," she whispered. Chad gave her a small nod. "You're welcome." As he watched her head upstairs, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something he hadn't anticipated. He didn't know why she was here, or how she had ended up on the side of the road, but something told him that her arrival would change everything. That night, after checking on Mia and making sure the girl had everything she needed, Chad stood by the fire, staring into the flames. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a simple act of kindness. This was the beginning of a new chapter in his life, one he hadn't expected and wasn't quite sure he was ready for. But then again, maybe none of them were ready. Unexpected bonds. The night passed quietly at the cabin. The wind still howled outside, but inside, the warmth from the fire and the soft scent of cinnamon created a peaceful atmosphere. Chad had spent the evening cleaning up after dinner and settling Mia into bed, but he couldn't shake the image of the young girl, Ellie, from his mind. She had barely said a word since he picked her up, and Chad respected her silence. There was something in her eyes, something deep, that made him realize she wasn't just lost in the cold, she was lost in life. The weight of her pain was as clear as the snowflakes falling outside, each one unique but all falling with the same quiet inevitability. Chad sat in his armchair, his gaze drawn to the fire. He had learned the art of keeping his own pain to himself after Laura passed. His heart had shattered the day he lost her, and the broken pieces never quite fit back together. But Mia had kept him going, her smile, her laughter, her strength. She had been his anchor through it all. And now, in the silence of the cabin, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected. Ellie was in his life now for reasons he didn't fully understand, but somehow, her presence felt like more than just a coincidence. It was as if fate had brought them together, two people from very different walks of life, both struggling with their own losses and fears, both needing something they didn't even know they were missing. The next morning, the soft light of dawn filtered through the small cabin windows, illuminating the quiet beauty of the snow-covered world outside. Chad woke early, as he always did, but today felt different. He knew Ellie was still upstairs, likely still sleeping, though he didn't know what her nights were like. What kind of nightmares haunted her, if any? What had driven her to the streets that night, shivering and alone? He stood and stretched, his muscles sore from the long hours of work. He moved through the cabin, checking the woodpile, making sure the stove was still going. Mia was still asleep, curled up in her blanket, her small form tucked up in a peaceful, childlike pose. Chad smiled softly, a warmth in his chest that was familiar, yet different. It wasn't just his love for Mia that filled him now, it was the understanding that he wasn't alone anymore, at least not entirely. After making coffee, Chad headed upstairs to check on Ellie. The door to the guest room was cracked open, and he gently knocked before stepping inside. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, her back hunched. Her posture was one of deep contemplation, but there was an undeniable fragility in the way she held herself, as though a single word could break her. "Morning," Chad said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "There's coffee downstairs if you'd like some." Ellie didn't turn right away, but after a moment, she glanced over her shoulder. Her face was still pale from the cold, but there was something softer about her expression now. She was awake, but not fully present, as though the warmth of the cabin hadn't yet reached the cold corners of her heart. "Thanks," she said in a low voice, then stood up slowly. She still moved with the caution of someone who wasn't sure if they belonged anywhere. Chad nodded and left her to her space, going downstairs to tend to Mia. As he made breakfast, he couldn't help but think about how different this morning felt. He hadn't expected to take in a young woman, let alone one who was pregnant, but here they were. And despite the strange circumstances, there was a quiet peace in the way things had settled into a rhythm already. Mia wandered into the kitchen a few minutes later, still in her pajamas, her hair a messy halo around her face. "Good morning, Dad," she said, her voice sleepy but full of warmth. "Good morning, kiddo," Chad replied, giving her a smile as he flipped pancakes onto a plate. Mia took her seat at the table, her usual curiosity making an appearance. "Where's the girl from last night?" Chad hesitated for a moment, then spoke gently. "She's still upstairs, Mia. I'm not sure when she'll be ready to join us, but she's safe." Mia nodded thoughtfully. She didn't ask many questions, but Chad knew her well enough to understand the concern in her eyes. She was worried, but she also trusted him. In her young heart, she had learned the value of kindness, of helping others, even when it wasn't easy. Ellie joined them soon after, standing awkwardly in the doorway. Her clothes were still the same as the night before, but they were dry now. The weight of her silence hung in the air, but Chad could see that she was trying. She was making an effort to take small steps, to start over, even though she didn't yet know how. "You can sit here if you like," Mia said, gesturing to the seat across from her. Her small voice was bright, hopeful, as though she truly believed that this could work, that Ellie could be a part of their little world. Ellie hesitated, but after a moment she walked over and sat down, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She didn't speak at first, but when the pancakes were served, she took a small bite, her face softening just slightly as the warmth of the food began to take the edge off her hunger and exhaustion. Chad watched them both, Mia, full of the kind of optimism that only a child could possess, and Ellie, guarded and withdrawn, unsure of what to make of this sudden kindness. Chad didn't know what Ellie's story was, but he had a feeling that the longer she stayed, the more they would both reveal about themselves, whether they were ready or not. The next few days passed slowly. Ellie didn't talk much, but she began to help around the cabin. At first, it was just small things, setting the table, folding laundry, but over time she started to open up, if only just a little. She didn't trust easily, but Chad could see her hesitation turning into something else, something more hopeful. She was trying to find her place, and he was doing his best to offer her the space she needed. Mia, of course, was the one who made things easier. She never questioned Ellie's presence. She just accepted her as part of the home, like a puzzle piece that had fit into place without anyone trying. It wasn't long before Mia was showing Ellie how to make snow angels in the yard, their laughter filling the still air as they played in the snow together. For the first time in a long while, Ellie allowed herself to smile. It wasn't a huge smile, but it was real. And for Chad, that was enough. But as the days turned into weeks, Chad couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Ellie's story, something deeper than what she had shared. He knew he was only scratching the surface, but as he looked at her, fragile yet determined, he also saw something that mirrored his own struggles, the need for redemption, the desire to rebuild a life that had been torn apart. And somewhere deep inside, Chad knew that Ellie's presence in their lives wasn't just a random act of kindness, it was the start of a new chapter, a chapter he hadn't been prepared for, but one he couldn't imagine living without now. A fragile trust. The days following Ellie's arrival at Chad's cabin were quiet, but they were also filled with an undercurrent of tension. Ellie wasn't sure how long she would stay, and Chad didn't ask. It wasn't like he was trying to push her out, it was just that the uncertainty hung between them like an invisible wall. Chad's life had always been structured, and he was used to being alone except for Maisie, of course, who was more of a daughter to him than anything. He wasn't a man who dealt with change easily. The silence that had once been a comfort now felt suffocating, with Ellie's presence filling the spaces of his home. There was the sound of her small, cautious steps when she walked into the kitchen, the quiet hum of the shower running, and sometimes, just the occasional whisper of her voice when she spoke to Maisie. In the evenings, when the two of them sat by the fire, Chad found himself observing her more than he ever meant to. He noticed how Ellie curled up in the corner of the couch with a blanket wrapped tightly around her. He noticed how her hands shook slightly when she reached for her mug of tea, and how she still had that distant, haunted look in her eyes. It wasn't a look that faded easily. Her life, too, had been interrupted by harsh realities, and now she was here, trying to piece together something she could call home. But true trust, was something that could take years to build, and Chad wasn't sure if either of them was ready for that. The quiet nights passed with a slow rhythm. Maisie's curiosity about Ellie had been intense at first, but now it had softened into the kind of affection only a child could offer. She'd draw pictures of Ellie, and every once in a while she'd ask questions like, "Why doesn't Ellie have any family?" or "Does she miss her mom?" Chad never had all the answers, but he tried his best to offer the comfort she needed. As for Ellie, the shift from complete isolation to being in a home with two strangers, no matter how kind Chad had been, was more disorienting than she had expected. There were days when she'd retreat to the upstairs bedroom, sitting in the dim light, staring out the window as the snow fell endlessly outside. The cold, crisp winter nights reminded her of the life she had left behind, the life that had ultimately led her here, to a stranger's home, pregnant and alone. But slowly, something began to change. One morning, after Maisie had gone off to school, Ellie found herself in the kitchen, staring at a bowl of fruit she had been meaning to peel for hours. Her thoughts wandered, and before she knew it, she was washing the dishes without even realizing it. She hadn't been this engaged in anything for months, years maybe. It was like the routine of living, of just existing in this space, was starting to settle into her bones. "Do you need help with that?" Chad's voice broke the silence, pulling her out of her thoughts. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves and the faintest smile on his face. Ellie bit her lip, embarrassed by her own thoughts. "I'm fine, really," she said, turning back to the dishes. Chad didn't move. He stood there for a moment, watching her before he stepped inside. "You know, I'm not in any rush," he said gently. "You don't have to do everything on your own." She looked up at him, feeling a strange lump form in her throat. He wasn't pushing her. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He was just offering, as if it was a completely normal thing to do. That thought made something shift inside her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft. Chad nodded, then left the room, giving her space. But his gesture, that quiet act of kindness, stayed with her. It was as though he had pulled her back from the edge of her own isolation without even knowing it. The rest of the week unfolded in much the same way. Ellie began to help out with small things around the house. She folded laundry while Maisie played, set the table for dinner, and even helped Chad chop vegetables for a stew one evening. With each passing day, she began to feel less like an outsider in the Callahan household. But despite the progress, trust was still fragile. Ellie hadn't told him much about her past, about why she had ended up on the side of the road that night. And Chad, despite his natural inclination to help, didn't push her. He knew that forcing her to talk about the past could only break the fragile bridge they were beginning to build. One evening, as the snowstorm outside howled louder than usual, the three of them huddled by the fire. Maisie was tucked into her blanket, her eyes fluttering as she tried to stay awake, and Chad leaned back in his chair, sipping his tea. Ellie was sitting across from him, her fingers nervously picking at the edge of her blanket. "Do you ever wonder why some people are stuck in a rut and others get to live their lives freely?" Ellie asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but there was a certain vulnerability in it that made Chad pause. Chad looked at her, sensing the weight behind her words. "Everyone's got their own story. It doesn't always make sense," he said slowly, setting his mug down. "Sometimes life puts you in places you don't want to be, but it doesn't mean you're stuck forever." Ellie's gaze softened. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I was so sure of everything before, and now I don't even know who I am anymore." Chad's heart went out to her. It wasn't just her pregnancy that had shaken her. It was something deeper, a feeling of displacement, like she was walking through life with no direction. And yet, here she was, sitting in front of him, still trying to move forward, despite everything that had happened. "You'll figure it out," Chad said, his voice reassuring. "One day at a time, Ellie. You've already made it this far. That's something." For a moment, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the storm outside. Ellie looked at him, her eyes glistening. She didn't say anything more, but the silence between them held an understanding. That night, Ellie slept in the guest room, but not without hearing the soft laughter of Maisie as she drifted off to sleep. The house, once filled with silence and emptiness, now felt alive with the sounds of life and warmth. It was a slow process, but Ellie was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future she never thought she could have. As she closed her eyes that night, the faintest sense of peace settled over her. For the first time in months, Ellie felt like she might have a place in the world again. And that fragile trust, the one she had begun to build with Chad and Maisie, was the first step towards something she had never imagined, a new beginning. Breaking barriers. The storm outside seemed endless, but inside the small cabin, there was warmth, both from the fire crackling in the hearth and from the quiet, growing bond between Ellie and Chad's little family. Chad, though still deeply grieving the loss of his wife, had slowly come to accept the reality that his life had changed in ways he never expected. And Ellie, who had arrived on that cold, snowy night as a scared, pregnant teenager, was starting to feel the first flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first few days after the storm, Ellie stayed in the room upstairs, keeping to herself. She still felt like a stranger in this new, unfamiliar place, even though Chad had done everything he could to make her feel welcome. His kindness, although genuine, seemed to remind her of just how lost she was. But she couldn't deny that something inside her was shifting. The walls she had built around herself were starting to crumble, piece by piece, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to let anyone in. Chad, for his part, was doing his best to be a father to Mia and a protector to Ellie, even though he wasn't sure how to juggle both responsibilities. Mia, his sweet, bright-eyed daughter, had been an anchor in his life ever since his wife passed away. She had filled the silence in their home with laughter and love. But now he was watching her reach out to Ellie with a tenderness he hadn't expected. Mia seemed to see Ellie not as someone broken, but as someone who needed love, and that was a gift in itself. One morning, as the light from the rising sun filtered through the cabin's windows, Chad found Mia sitting quietly at the kitchen table. Her face was thoughtful, and her small hands were carefully folding a piece of paper. "Mia?" Chad asked, leaning against the doorframe watching her. Mia looked up, her face lighting up when she saw her father. "I made this for Ellie," she said, holding out the folded paper. "I want her to feel at home." Chad's heart clenched at the sight of the drawing. It was a picture of Ellie, with a big heart around her, and the words, "You're safe here," written in colorful crayon. Mia's simple gesture of kindness spoke volumes, far beyond what words could express. "You're a kind girl, Mia," Chad said softly, walking over to his daughter and kissing the top of her head. "Ellie will really appreciate this." Mia smiled, a warm, knowing smile that made Chad feel like he might just be getting this whole fatherhood thing right after all. Later that day, Chad decided it was time to check on Ellie. He knocked lightly on the door to her room, his voice calm but filled with concern. "Ellie, I thought you might like some lunch," Chad called softly. Ellie hesitated for a moment before opening the door. Her eyes were still guarded, but there was a vulnerability in them that Chad hadn't noticed before. She stepped aside, allowing him into the room. "Thanks, but I'm not very hungry," Ellie murmured, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Chad could sense her discomfort, the walls she'd built up still very much in place. But he also saw something else, an emptiness, a longing for connection that she wasn't ready to admit. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," Chad said, his tone gentle. "But if you ever do, I'm here, for whatever you need. You don't have to go through this alone." Ellie's eyes flickered with something close to hope, and for a split second, Chad thought she might open up, but instead she nodded silently, her gaze dropping to the floor. She didn't say anything, but the slight tension in her shoulders seemed to ease just a little. "I'll leave the lunch on the table," Chad added, his voice light. "You don't have to eat now, but it's there whenever you're ready." As he turned to leave, Chad paused in the doorway and glanced back. "Ellie, just know that you're not a burden here. You're part of this family now, and we take care of each other." Ellie didn't respond, but Chad felt a small flicker of something shift in the room. Maybe it was just a seed of trust, but it was enough for him to feel hopeful. Later that evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth and Mia played quietly with her toys, Chad sat down beside Ellie at the kitchen table. He had been watching her, observing how she had slowly started to interact with Mia, even if it was just small gestures here and there. But he knew that Ellie's healing process would take time, and that he couldn't rush it. "Ellie," Chad said quietly, his voice carrying more warmth than he felt. "I know things aren't easy for you right now. I can't pretend to understand what you've been through, but I want you to know that you're safe here. You're not alone anymore." Ellie's gaze met his, her eyes softening just slightly. "I don't know if I can believe that," she whispered. "I know it's hard," Chad replied, leaning forward. "But Mia and we're here for you. You don't have to trust us all at once, but I hope in time you'll see that we want to help you." Ellie blinked back the tears that threatened to spill over, and for the first time in days, she let herself feel something other than fear. Maybe, just maybe, this strange family could be the healing she needed. As the days passed, the connection between Ellie and the Callahans deepened, not in grand, dramatic gestures, but in the small, everyday moments like when Ellie helped Mia make pancakes on a Saturday morning, or when Mia taught Ellie how to make snow angels outside. In those simple acts, something beautiful was being built. And for Chad, who had once believed that the only way to protect his heart was to keep it locked away, he was starting to realize that there was another way to live, one where love, healing, and connection could come from the most unexpected of places. That night, as the storm outside subsided and the world seemed to settle into a peaceful quiet, Chad found himself standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape. He knew that their lives had been changed forever, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he was no longer walking it alone. A new hope. The days were beginning to stretch longer, and while the snow still blanketed the landscape outside, inside the cabin, things were slowly changing. Chad had never imagined that his life could feel so full of life again. It wasn't the kind of fullness he had once known with his wife, Laura, but it was a kind of peace he hadn't expected to find. Ellie had started to settle into the routine of the cabin, though she still kept a quiet distance. There were moments of connection, moments where she allowed herself to be part of the family, but the walls she had built around herself were still there, deep-rooted in the silence she had carried for so long. Yet Chad noticed something every time Ellie looked at Mia. Something softened in her eyes. And in turn, Mia had started to draw closer to Ellie. The bond between them, though quiet, was growing stronger with each passing day. Chad found himself watching them more often than he meant to. It wasn't just the way Mia made Ellie smile with her innocent, unspoken kindness, or the way Ellie would smile faintly as Mia tried to teach her how to bake cookies. It was the way both girls seemed to need each other, like they were two broken pieces that fit together in ways neither of them had expected. One afternoon, after a light snowfall had dusted the ground, Chad found himself outside, chopping wood. The rhythmic sound of the axe striking the logs was almost meditative. He had learned to love this simple life after Laura's death, finding solace in the tasks that kept his hands busy and his mind clear. But even in this routine, Ellie's presence in the house weighed on him. He wasn't sure what to do next. As he took a break, wiping the sweat from his brow, he noticed Mia and Ellie outside, standing in the snow. Ellie had a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and Mia was jumping up and down, her breath forming little clouds in the cold air. "Come on, Ellie," Mia's voice rang out, full of excitement. "Let's make the biggest snowman ever." Chad smiled softly to himself, watching as Ellie hesitated for a moment before finally letting herself go. She bent down and started rolling a snowball, her movements stiff but determined. And Mia, with her infectious energy, jumped right in, her giggles carrying on the crisp winter air. It was a small moment, but for Chad, it was the most significant one of the day. Ellie was finally starting to let go of the weight she had been carrying for so long. She was letting herself experience joy again, even if it was just in the simple act of playing in the snow. Later that evening, as the three of them sat together by the fire, Chad couldn't help but notice the shift in the atmosphere. Ellie was no longer the quiet, guarded stranger who had walked through their door weeks ago. She was still reserved, but there was a softness to her now, a subtle warmth in her presence. It was as if the walls around her heart were slowly starting to crumble, piece by piece. "Ellie, I want to ask you something," Chad said quietly, his voice filled with a sincerity that made her look up from her mug of tea. Ellie glanced at him, her expression guarded, but she didn't look away. She nodded, as if bracing herself for whatever question he might ask. "Do you ever think about what you want for your future?" Chad asked. "I know it's been hard, but I believe you've got something inside of you that's stronger than you know." Ellie's eyes flickered with something, maybe hope, maybe uncertainty. She set her mug down, staring into the flames of the fire. For a long time, she didn't speak. Chad could tell she was processing, her thoughts running deeper than he could imagine. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to have dreams, before everything fell apart. But now it feels like those dreams don't belong to me anymore." Chad's heart ached as he listened. He wanted to tell her that it wasn't too late, that there was still time to rebuild, but he knew it wasn't his place to force that kind of change on her. She had to find her own way, at her own pace. "Maybe the dreams don't have to be the same as they were," Chad said softly. "Maybe they just need to change, evolve. You've been through a lot, Ellie, but I think you're strong enough to start building something new, a future that's yours." Ellie looked at him then, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to hope. It wasn't a big hope, not yet, but it was enough. "Maybe," she murmured. As the evening stretched on, Chad and Ellie sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Mia had already drifted off to sleep, her small form curled up on the couch with her blanket, a soft smile still on her face from her afternoon of fun. Chad couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him, the quiet kind that comes when you know, deep down, that things are slowly starting to fall into place. The next morning, when the sun rose over the snow-covered world outside, Ellie did something she hadn't done before. She got up early, before Chad or Mia, and went outside. She stood there in the quiet, looking at the snow-covered meadow, the world around her as still and peaceful as the feeling inside her heart. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Chad found her a few minutes later, standing outside with a hand on her belly, looking at the horizon. "You okay?" Chad asked, walking over to her slowly. Ellie turned to him and smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Yeah," she said. "I think I'm starting to figure it out." Chad nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure where this journey would take them. But for the first time, he felt certain of one thing. Ellie was finding her way. And with every step, she was becoming a part of their family, whether she realized it or not. The road to redemption. The days were getting longer, and the winter's grip was starting to loosen, though the snow still clung to the ground in patches. The air had an edge to it, but the soft light of early spring seemed to bring with it a sense of possibility, an unspoken promise of change, of something new. Chad stood at the edge of the porch one evening, looking out at the view of the still, snow-covered hills. The sky was a deep, soft blue, the kind that only comes when the day is winding down, and the world seems to hold its breath before the night. In the distance, he could hear the faint sounds of birds' robins, probably returning, signaling that the harshest part of the season had passed. He exhaled slowly, watching his breath cloud in front of him before it vanished into the cold air. He could feel it too, the change. It was in the air, in the house, in the quiet way Ellie had been moving around lately. For the first time since she arrived, Chad felt a real shift between them. It wasn't just the tentative kindness that had grown over the weeks. It was something more, something he wasn't ready to label, but something that felt as big as the mountains that surrounded their small cabin. Inside, Mia was playing with her toys, the soft clink of her blocks filling the house with a rhythm that had become a background hum to Chad's thoughts. Ellie, on the other hand, had been quieter these past few days. Not in a withdrawn way, but more introspective. He'd seen her sitting by the window often, gazing out at the snow as if she was lost in thought, and when he spoke to her, there was a slight distance in her eyes, a quiet sadness that hadn't quite faded. Chad knew that Ellie hadn't shared much about her past, and he wasn't sure if she ever would, but he could see the weight she carried, even if she didn't talk about it. There were days when it felt like she was on the edge of telling him something important, but the words never came. And he understood that. The pain she had gone through wasn't something you could just say in passing. It would take time to open up, to trust again. One morning, after Mia had left for school, Chad found Ellie sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of fruit she had started to peel but hadn't finished. She was deep in thought, her fingers absently rubbing the skin of the apple, the motion repetitive, as though it could calm the storm inside her. Chad didn't say anything at first. He just leaned against the doorframe, watching her in silence for a moment. Finally he spoke, his voice low and gentle. "You okay?" Ellie jumped slightly, her head snapping up to meet his gaze. She hadn't noticed him standing there. For a second she looked at him like she didn't quite recognize who he was. Her face was pale, a little drawn, and for the first time in days, he noticed the hint of vulnerability in her eyes. "Yeah," she said, her voice shaky but soft. "I'm fine." Chad nodded but didn't move. "If you ever need to talk, Ellie, I'm here. You don't have to do this alone." Ellie's gaze dropped back to the apple in her hand, her fingers still curled around it. She wasn't sure what to say, or if she even could say what was on her mind. A part of her felt like talking would only make the pain worse. Another part of her was afraid that opening up would mean losing the only sense of stability she'd ever had. "Thanks," she finally murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Chad's heart tightened at the sound of her voice. It was filled with a rawness, an ache that he knew all too well. He didn't press her, though. He knew better than to push someone into talking before they were ready. Instead, he walked over to the stove and started preparing breakfast for Mia, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. Later that day, as the light began to fade and the house settled into the quiet rhythm of evening, Ellie found herself sitting on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her. Mia was at the table, drawing another picture this time of Ellie, with a big heart surrounding her. Ellie had never expected this from a little girl, but she found herself touched by the simple act of kindness. When Mia came over and handed her the drawing, Ellie couldn't help but smile. It was a small but genuine smile, one that reached her eyes, though it faded quickly as if she was unsure if she could keep it there for long. "Thanks, Mia," Ellie said softly, taking the drawing and looking at it for a long moment. "It's beautiful," Mia beamed. "I want you to feel safe here," she said in her usual way of speaking, like a simple statement of fact. It wasn't forced, it wasn't dramatic, it was just the truth as she saw it. And in that moment, Ellie realized how much she'd been hiding, how much of herself she had locked away from the world. That night, as Ellie lay in bed, she found herself thinking about the kindness she had been given. She had never experienced this kind of compassion before, not in the way it was being offered to her now. And though it was hard to accept, she couldn't deny that it was starting to change her. She was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, there was something worth holding on to, something worth fighting for. But there was still that nagging fear inside her, the fear that one day she would have to face the full weight of her past, and that no amount of kindness could ever undo what had been done to her. The next morning, after Mia had gone to school, Ellie sat by the window again, looking out at the world. The snow was still falling softly, but the days were warmer, and the light was starting to feel different. Spring was coming, and with it, a sense of change, a sense of hope, even if it was only a whisper. Chad came up behind her, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. He placed it gently on the table beside her, his presence quiet but constant. "You know," Chad said softly, "I didn't think I could do this. Raise Mia, take care of her, keep my own head above water after Laura." He paused, the mention of his late wife still an ache he couldn't fully explain. "But you learn. You adapt. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, but you keep going. And that's what I'm trying to do. For Mia. For myself. For you." Ellie turned her head, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not sure I can keep going," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't know if I can ever be who I was before." Chad's heart softened. He could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty, and for a moment, he wondered if he was doing enough to help her. He hadn't asked for her to be in his life, but she was here, and he wasn't about to let her slip away. "You don't have to have it all figured out, Ellie," Chad said, his voice warm with understanding. "You don't have to be anyone other than yourself. All you need to do is take it one step at a time. I'm not going anywhere. Mia isn't going anywhere. And we're not going to leave you behind." Ellie's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. But the truth was, she didn't need to say anything. The words weren't important anymore. It was the simple, steady presence of Chad, the warmth of his offer, that made all the difference. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. And maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible after all. New hope, new beginnings. The winter had begun to lose its sharp bite. Though the snow still lingered on the ground, the air had softened, and the days were stretching longer, hinting at the promise of spring. The cabin, once quiet and filled with only the sound of Chad's work and Mia's laughter, now hummed with an unfamiliar energy. Ellie, though still reserved and often lost in thought, had slowly begun to emerge from the shell she'd been hiding in. One crisp morning, as the sun finally made an appearance after days of snow, Chad found Ellie in the kitchen. She was sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly on top of a letter. There was an air of determination about her that Chad hadn't noticed before. "I've been thinking," Ellie said, her voice steady, though it held a hint of hesitation, "about what comes next, about what I'm supposed to do with this life." Chad set the mug of coffee he'd been holding down on the table and took a seat across from her. He could see the gears turning in her mind, the uncertainty still clouding her eyes, but there was something different now, a spark of something more hopeful. "Sometimes," Chad started, his voice calm but reassuring, "life throws you a curveball, and all you can do is try to catch it and make the best of it. But the road ahead, that's something only you can figure out." Ellie nodded, her lips trembling slightly as she folded the letter she had been holding. "I applied to the nursing program in Providence," she said quietly. "It's a 1-year program. They accepted me." Chad's eyes widened in surprise, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only genuine support. "That's incredible, Ellie. Really. I'm proud of you." Ellie gave a small, uncertain smile, though the weight of her decision was still heavy on her shoulders. "I don't know if I can do it. It's all new and everything's different now. What if I fail?" Chad leaned forward slightly, his voice soft but full of conviction. "You've already been through so much, Ellie, and you're still here. You've made it this far. What you're doing isn't failing. It's living. And I believe in you. Mia believes in you too." Ellie's gaze softened at the mention of Mia, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a warmth in her chest. She hadn't realized how much she had come to rely on this small family, how much she had started to see them not as saviors, but as partners. She wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. "I don't want to leave you both," Ellie admitted softly. "I don't want to lose this family, but I also need to find my own way." make something of myself. For my daughter, for me. Chad reached across the table, placing a hand over hers gently, his touch steady and grounding. I get that, he said, his voice firm with reassurance. But you're not leaving us behind. You're just taking the next step in your journey, and we'll be right here, cheering you on. Mia, who had been quietly listening from the kitchen doorway, suddenly piped up, her small voice full of excitement. Are you going to be a nurse, Ellie? She asked eagerly. Ellie's heart swelled at the innocent question. I hope so, Mia. I'm going to try my best. Mia nodded enthusiastically, running over to Ellie and wrapping her arms around her waist. I know you can do it. I believe in you. Ellie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. For the first time since she had arrived at the cabin, she truly felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, something that wasn't just about survival, but about growth and possibility. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations. Ellie started attending classes at the local community center, where she received a crash course in nursing basics. Chad and Mia supported her in every way they could, even if it meant Chad adjusting his schedule to accommodate her classes, or Mia helping around the house more. One night, as the snow continued to fall outside, Ellie was sitting at the kitchen table, studying her textbooks. Chad had just returned from the shop and Mia was getting ready for bed. The house was quiet, peaceful, but a shift was happening. Chad could feel it in the air, a shift in Ellie, in Mia, and in himself. It was a quiet kind of healing, the kind that wasn't rushed or forced, just the slow, steady progress of time working its magic. How was class today? Chad asked, breaking the silence. Ellie looked up from her book, a small smile playing at her lips. It was hard, she admitted, but I think I'm getting the hang of it. I actually feel like I might be able to do this. Chad smiled back at her, proud of how far she'd come. You will, and we'll be here to support you, every step of the way. Mia, having overheard the conversation, bounced into the kitchen, her face lighting up when she saw Ellie. Are you still going to be my nurse someday? She asked with a grin. Ellie laughed softly. I hope so, Mia. I'll be the best nurse I can be. And just like that, the air in the cabin seemed a little lighter. The unspoken fears that had haunted Ellie, fears of failure, fears of being unworthy, seemed to dissipate in the warmth of their support. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. As the weeks turned into months, Ellie continued her studies, growing more confident with each passing day. She still had moments of doubt, moments when she questioned if she was on the right path, but those moments grew fewer. With Chad's steady presence and Mia's unwavering belief in her, Ellie began to see a future she had once thought impossible. And as spring slowly began to bloom outside the cabin, Ellie made a decision. She would go to Providence. She would finish the program. And with time, she would find a way to build a life for herself and her daughter, one that was full of purpose, hope, and a love that had been forged in the most unexpected of places. A new dawn. The first rays of the morning sun broke through the dense clouds, casting soft golden light across the snow-covered world outside Chad's cabin. The wind had calmed, and the world felt quieter, almost serene. It was the kind of morning that felt full of promise, a quiet acknowledgement that life, no matter how difficult, always offered a chance for a fresh start. Inside, the cabin was warm. The fire had burned low, but its embers still glowed, providing the perfect backdrop to the quiet morning routine. Mia was already awake, her small form huddled by the window, gazing out at the winter landscape, her thoughts still caught between the dream world and the real one. Ellie, too, was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea in her hands, her eyes lost in the steam as it curled up in the cold air. Chad stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. The cabin, which had once felt empty and quiet after Laura's passing, now felt alive with presence. He watched his daughter Mia humming softly to herself as she arranged her favorite toys on the table. She had grown so much over the past few months, and Chad couldn't help but feel grateful for the love and light she brought into his life, even on the darkest days. Ellie, though still quiet and reserved, had made tremendous progress. The pain in her eyes had softened, replaced with a quiet determination that spoke volumes. Her journey from that cold night on the road to this moment had been long and fraught with struggle, but Ellie was finally beginning to believe in the possibility of a new beginning. Chad had always known that life was full of uncertainty, but he'd never expected it to unfold this way. The decision to take Ellie in, to give her shelter and compassion, had been a leap of faith, one that he wasn't sure he was ready for. Yet now, he couldn't imagine life without her. In the weeks that followed that cold night, They had all learned to care for each other in ways they hadn't known were possible. Ellie looked up, catching Chad's gaze across the room. Their eyes met, and there was a quiet understanding between them, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through, together and apart. She had come to him broken, afraid, and unsure of the future, but now she was different. She was stronger, more grounded. And although there were still moments when the weight of her past lingered in her eyes, she was no longer the girl lost in the storm. She was someone who had found her way back to herself and to the people who cared for her. Mia, oblivious to the weight of the past, looked up and grinned at Ellie. "Do you want to build a snow fort today?" she asked eagerly. Her innocence, her eagerness to share love and joy was contagious. Ellie hesitated for a moment, her gaze flickering between Mia and Chad, but then something shifted in her expression. A small smile, hesitant but genuine. "I'd love to," Ellie replied softly, her voice carrying the promise of something new, something hopeful. Chad stood up from where he had been leaning against the doorframe and walked over to them. He placed a hand on Mia's shoulder, smiling at the simplicity of the moment. "I'll join you," he said, his voice warm. "We could use some fun today." As the three of them bundled up and stepped outside, the snow crunched beneath their boots. The world was still and silent, save for their laughter and the soft whisper of the winter wind. Mia was the first to dive into the snow, laughing as she made snow angels, her joy infectious. Ellie followed, her steps slower, but her smile growing as she watched Mia's carefree spirit. Chad too joined in, gathering the snow into big, soft clumps to help build their fort. It was in these small moments that Chad realized just how far they had all come. He could see Ellie's heart slowly opening, her trust in them becoming more solid with each passing day. She was no longer just the girl who had wandered into their lives in the cold of night. She was becoming part of their family, and they were becoming part of hers. Later that day, as they sat together around the fire, sipping hot cocoa and watching the snow fall outside, Chad felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that they had built something real, something worth holding on to. Mia leaned against him, her small hand tucked into his. Ellie, sitting on the other side of the room, had started writing again, her notebook open on her lap. Chad didn't need to see the words to know what they were. Ellie had found her voice again, and it was powerful. "I think," Chad said quietly, his voice low but steady, "we're going to be okay." Ellie glanced up at him, her eyes warm, full of understanding. "Yeah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I think we are." As the fire flickered and the room filled with the quiet sounds of a family at peace, Chad knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they had already come so far. Together, they had found healing, trust, and the kind of love that didn't need words to be understood. And in the warmth of the firelight, surrounded by the people who cared for her, Ellie finally felt what she had been searching for all along: home.